see me behind this. Buenas noches. Good evening. Don't worry, this isn't in English. Someday we'll run this in Spanish. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to, my name is Eleonora Bertrano, and I teach Hispanic Studies, and I'm part of the Latino Latin American Studies program. And I want to remind you, it came with the announcement of this event, that we have the option for students to attend all 3 events and then join in taking LAS 270 readings in Latin America. So considering this is the first event, you still have time, and you're here, you still have time to decide if you want to take LAS 270. I will collect names of interested people. I already have 5, and I will send you an email with more information, and so you can decide if you want to take 270 for 0 or 1 credit. And the option also to join the mural group that started work last semester, and it's just getting started with painting, right, Anna? Right?
We're starting to paint it now.
Okay, so you can still take more students, right? And join that process. Okay. You can hear me well, right? Okay. So this is, like I said, our first event, and Dr. Paul Dosh is an expert in Latin American politics, who's been teaching in the Department of Political Science at McAllister College in St. Paul, in Minnesota, since 2004. He completed a bachelor's degree in Carleton College and his PhD at the University of California in Berkeley. He is the author of Demanding the Land, Urban Popular Movements in Peru and Ecuador, 1990-2005. And he has published many journal and scholarly articles in English and in Spanish. So we can look him up and read a lot of his work is available online, right? In 2010, he launched Building Dignity, a nonprofit organization based in the St. Paul, Minnesota, and Lima, Peru, connecting the 2 cities, that works to support neighborhood development by empowering local leaders. And that website is also available and updated, and it's very, very interesting, and working with opportunities for us to help too that way. In this first event of LLAS series, then Spring 2020, called Social Movements in the Americas, Power, Rights, and Resources, Dr. Dosh will present tactics of decolonization, indigenous movements in Latin America. So please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Paul Dosh.
Thank you, Eleonora. Can you hear me okay? So, it is true that my name is Paul Dosh, but we're studying social movements, so I should tell you that my full name is Paul Gandhi Joseph Dosh. My brother is Martin Luther King Chavez Dosh. My nephew is Mandela, and my son is Wellstone. This family takes no chances. I've been involved in social movements my whole life growing up. Grew up in a radical Catholic family. Was very committed to making a difference in Central America. At age 12, my parents let me go to Nicaragua during the Contra Civil War without them. High school youth group, I was a very motivated 12-year-old. I said, I want to help stop the Reagan wars in Central America. It was a radicalizing experience for me, really put me on a life path, beginning to learn Spanish and getting involved in social justice work in Latin America. Tonight's discussion focuses on indigenous social movements. If we're going to talk about indigenous struggles, it's essential that we begin our discussion by acknowledging a shared piece of history that Macalester College, my campus, and St. Ben's have, which is that the land that we benefit from, that we occupy, is Dakota land. The Dakota people lost their homelands to violence, theft, and oppression in the form of settler colonialism. This past year, I was involved in organizing an event at Macalester called the International Roundtable, focused on mass incarceration. And through helping put those events together, I learned that in our prisons and jails, Native Americans are vastly overrepresented. Native Americans make up only 1% of Minnesota's population, but occupy 8% of our jail cells and prison cells. Here at Stillwater, down the road, down Highway 10. I think in the work we do as scholars, we need to be attentive to the position and the positions that we occupy. I'm a white, privileged man from a rich Minnesota liberal arts college. And I do work in some of the poorest neighborhoods in South America. I work in Lima, Peru, Quito, Ecuador, El Alto, Bolivia, then I work in Colombia, Mexico City. And when I enter those spaces and try to enter them as a scholar, but also as an ally, the privilege that I carry with me really shapes every encounter that I have. And I wanted to open our discussion tonight actually by sharing with you a poem that I wrote. I was doing research in a poor neighborhood in Lima, Peru, a neighborhood founded by an illegal land invasion. I was there doing dissertation research. I was there for 6 months in Lima and then 6 months in Quito. And I had to go to a wedding in Texas. So I flew up to Dallas, Fort Worth, went to the wedding. While I was there, I featured on a local poetry slam. I figured they'd want to know what I was doing in Peru. And so this poem is called, What Am I Doing in Peru? But as you'll hear, it's really about position and about how to conduct ethnographic research. In the skies of Peru, the sun, El Sol, reigns supreme, showering burning rays down the La Ciudad de Lima, where 7 million hide from El Sol under a thick veil of smog. In the poor district of Villa El Salvador, bronze bodies toil from dawn to dusk to dawn to earn a few coins called soles, suns. On Villa's desert slopes of Lomo de Corvina, squatters cannot find work for soles and cannot find shade from El Sol. By the Corvina garbage dump, the families of Paraíso, paradise, shore up sandbags to safeguard shanty homes from slipping down the steeps, and at the Paraíso General Store, heads of household, dressed in their Sunday best, plot battles to win land titles to each plot of sand. And at this meeting sits a political scientist, a very poorly dressed political scientist who had no idea that pobladores would dress like sparkling jewels for a meeting in the dump. You see, I need no reminders that I am not garbage. Your father collects my basura 6 times a week while his trash can waits, ever hopeful for its first pickup. Sitting at this meeting, I recall how my day began. Beep, 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 6 a.m. already. Why can't squatters meet at normal hours? Wash, comb, hair, dress, boot, hat, belt, dress, book, pen, coin, key, egg, toast, French press, taxi! So next to a seatbelt for a change. Look out for that Mercedes. Must you drive like a Peruvian? As green grass gives way to dry, dusty desert, my taxi speeds past buses lurching squatters to my mansion to garden, polish, scrub, my lawn, floor, toilet. Too soon the road ends, and with my nap depositing me in a dirty cul-de-sac optimistically named Oasis. From here I hike the hills on foot, ascend to conquer the sand dune slums to investigate, appreciate the challenge of shantytown life, and study the politics of the urban poor. But why travel so far from comfort when my interview subjects come to my home each day? Your aunt, 9 months pregnant, scrubs my toilet in the fated dream that she might one day have a toilet of her own to scrub. A dream dangerously predicated on politician promises that evaporate long before the painted slogans fade. My survey invades your life. Yet, when you agree to call me from the payphone, you won't even let me pay for the phone call that costs costs you an hour's work. You answer all my questions. Believe me, questioning my life, my bank account, my 23 years of Ivy education that cost more than 3,000 houses in your dump. Am I worth 3,000 homes? I'm a political scientist. I want to help you. I want to help you help yourself. I want to help myself know they're helping if you're helpless. No, this wasn't on the methodology exam. What am I doing? Your roof, cardboard, your toy, a piece of tried shit, yet you're beautiful. How do you keep so clean when you have no water, no soap, no Pert Plus for extra sensitive to the needs of your neighbor, when you don't even have a floor to stand on, just like I don't have a leg? Argument to justification to stand on when you ask me where I'm going for the weekend. Texas. Texas. Muy lejos. ¿Cuánto cuesta? How much will your weekend trip cost? I gotta go. Thank you. Position. So in thinking about indigenous social movements, including the community that I just described, predominantly indigenous, urban, in Lima. Tonight we're going to talk more about Mexico and Bolivia. But in thinking about these, I decided I wanted to try and get three things across to you tonight. One, I want to introduce, for those of you who are not already familiar, introduce you to the Zapatistas. The Zapatista Army of National Liberation. Many of you have some familiarity with the Zapatistas. But I want to introduce them to you as a way of talking about the concept of tactics of decolonization. Because although the Zapatistas have done many things, I think one way that the Zapatistas have left a major imprint on the Americas is through crystallizing the concept of decolonization, what it means, why it's important, and how activists might go about pursuing it. That's thing number one. Second task I want to accomplish is I want to delve into the case of Bolivia. Bolivia and what has happened in Bolivia in the last 20 years, I think could not have happened the way it happened without the Zapatista story before it. But Bolivia has become, in the last 20 years, the preeminent example of understanding indigenous struggles for power in the Americas, not just Latin America, but in the United States as well. Bolivia is a place you need to understand if you care about protests in Ontario this week of indigenous peoples stop objecting to pipelines to British Columbia. I would argue you need to understand what's happening in Bolivia if you want to understand those struggles up in Ontario of indigenous peoples. I'm going to explore the case of Bolivia through this lens of decolonization, to understand this incredible meteoric rise of indigenous power in Bolivia, as well as the sudden, abrupt, and violent diminution of indigenous power in Bolivia just in the last 5 months. Third, last short part, is I want to talk briefly about how community members here at St. Ben's and St. John's and McAllister, St. Cloud, Minneapolis, how we can educate and become more aware, but also how we can take action to be supportive of indigenous voices on campuses in Minnesota and in Latin America. After sunset on December 31st, 1993, the Zapatistas, who'd been organizing for about 10 years, nobody heard of them since 1983, but New Year's Eve, they got ready. They knew that the next morning, New Year's Day, 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement would go into effect. It had been signed 2 years earlier by presidents, executives of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, negotiated under President George H.W. Bush, then President Bill Clinton, and it was going into effect on January 1st. This struggle that the Zapatista would kick off would fuel resistance to neoliberal economic policies that prioritize the needs of the rich and the elite in Latin America over the needs of the excluded and the poor. And it would contribute to struggles, perhaps most famously in Seattle in 1999, the WTO protests shutting down the World Trade Organization conference, massive gatherings, and then a whole sequence of anti-globalization gatherings in Geneva, various places around the world. On New Year's Day in 1994, the Zapatistas emerged from the jungle and seized 7 towns in Chiapas, in southern Mexico, the largest of them being San Cristobal de las Casas, a small, quaint colonial town, major tourist destination, source of revenue, for the state government, and they made a big show of it. They performed revolution in addition to acting out revolution. They publicized it. The internet was a new thing. This was 1994. Later that year, I was studying away in Costa Rica. There were 25 of us college students. We all shared one email account for all 25 of us, and it was amazing. It was brand new. We had one email account to share for 25 of us. 12 months earlier, none of us had email accounts. So the Zapatistas, part of why their message got so far was they were one of the first adapters of the internet to propagate their message, to recruit, and to spread this message of decolonization. They captured those 7 towns, they freed prisoners from local jails, they secured highways, they burned police stations, and from the balcony of a ruined palace, they declared war on the Mexican government and on the policies of neoliberalism. They declared war, but actually one of the things that's distinctive about the Zapatistas is they didn't wage a war on the Mexican government. There was that rhetorical flourish, but they really quickly distinguished themselves as a group that wasn't about trying to take over the government. They weren't like revolutionaries, other revolutionary groups in Latin America, the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, the FMLN in El Salvador, the FARC in Colombia, that wanted to topple the government. Really, the Zapatistas said, we want the Mexican government to leave us alone. They said, we don't want to take over Mexico City. You can continue governing there. We want autonomy. We want to be left. We want a new system that is separate from this colonial regime. So briefly, the Zapatistas articulated this vision of decolonization. There's a political vision, but it's an economic vision as well. It had major social implications. They both thought of external decolonization as well as internal decolonization. Externally, the Zapatistas rejected economic relationships of other countries toward Mexico, and they rejected economic relationships of Mexico City and other parts of Mexico toward indigenous regions such as Chiapas in the south. And they rejected the political control of these entities. They said, we want to create our own political systems of governance. Internally, however, they also wanted to decolonize. So not only did the Zapatistas want to replace external control with local control, but the way local control happened. They wanted to create horizontal methods of governance that were more conclusive, that were more consensus-based. They wanted to include women. This was really distinctive. A third of the soldiers that participated on January 1st, 1994 were women. And although I would argue that actually sort of anti-patriarchy and a feminist, let's call it anti-patriarchy lens, really took a long time to fully emerge with the Zapatistas. I still think it's also true that in that first year or two, they really were leaders as a group in terms of foregrounding women's role in the struggle and women having meaningful roles. But I think there really was a fight that then took 20 years of women within the Zapatistas saying, this isn't enough. Our voices still are not the lead voices. We still are the second to come to the table. We ask to have a seat at the table, but it's not yet an equal seat. But nonetheless, this was a radical vision of how a group would function. And it wasn't just about governance, it was about economy. It was about alternative approach to modern farming. It was about not just changing who you were, how you were producing, but who you were producing for. Creating vibrant local consumer networks who were going to buy and sell from each other and be economically interdependent. Okay. Last thing I wanted to touch on here is liberation theology. Now, for some of you, have any of you studied the landless workers movement, the MST in Brazil? So the landless workers movement is a movement that I think liberation theology is really an important part of the MST story. In the case of the Zapatistas, I think liberation theology is something that touches down in important ways in the Zapatista story, but I wouldn't say it characterizes the Zapatista struggle. But here is the bishop of San Cristobal de las Casas, the bishop Luis Garcia, who toward the late 1990s, the Zapatistas are getting nowhere with their negotiations with the Mexican government. They've made a peace accord, but the Mexican government doesn't want to implement it, doesn't want to respect it. They turn to the local Catholic bishop to be the mediator. They recognize Bishop Luis Garcia, as an ally who is an ally of indigenous struggles, who can be a trusted, impartial arbiter and help move along this process. The process isn't successful, but I think it's notable that there are these liberation theology communities, and Luis Garcia is kind of a champion of those communities in southern Mexico, and those are Catholic allies of the Zapatistas in this moment. But it doesn't work. Mexico democratizes in 2000. The Zapatistas say, what democracy? The fact that elections are now happening in a competitive, fair way in Mexico doesn't impress the Zapatistas, who remain excluded. So I want to just take a 2-minute break here just to show you some images with music. And these are images taken by my colleague James Lariger of the 2001 Zappa Tour. So for 2 weeks in 2001, thousands of Zapatistas eventually, I'm not sure, I can't remember the numbers actually. So certainly in thousands, but I can't remember what it peaked at. Thousands of supporters of the Zapatistas and members led a caravan of about 24 trucks and people walking from Chiapas all the way to Mexico City. But they took a very indirect route, so it took 2 weeks, and they picked up more people along the way. And it was kind of a publicity. It was like a presidential campaign that you see, candidates going around by bus, except it was to raise awareness about indigenous rights, to raise awareness around the Zapatistas' demand for autonomy and demand for decolonization. So as you watch this, take a look, keep an eye out for women's presence, and keep an eye out for images that you suggest this decolonization project of challenging the idea that Chiapas should be subservient.
Ya se mira el horizonte, combatiente zapatista, el camino marcará a los que vienen atrás. Vamos, 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 vamos adelante, para que salgamos de la lucha avante, porque nuestra patria grita y necesita de todo el esfuerzo de los zapatistas. Hombres, niños y mujeres, el esfuerzo siempre haremos, campesinos, los obreros, todos juntos con el pueblo. Vamos, 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 vamos adelante, para que salgamos en la lucha avante, porque nuestra patria grita y necesita de todo el esfuerzo de los zapatistas. Nuestro pueblo exige ya acabar la explotación. Nuestra historia dice ya lucha de liberación. Vamos, 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 vamos adelante, para que salgamos en la lucha avante, porque nuestra patria grita y necesita de todo el esfuerzo de los zapatistas. Ejemplares hay que ser y seguir nuestras consignas, que vivamos por la patria o morir por la libertad. Vamos, 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 vamos adelante, para que salgamos en la lucha avante, porque nuestra patria grita y necesita de todo el esfuerzo de los zapatistas.
Second to last image there, before the Subcomandante Marcos image, the second to last image is the Central Plaza of Mexico City, the Zocalo. I don't know how many people were there. That's a lot of people. Silvio Rodriguez played there. From Cuba, they got 500,000 people, so I'm not sure how many were there, but that's a lot of people. And so at the final event, Mexico City drew an enormous number of allies that just showed up to show their support. But you know, the broader goals of the Zapatistas weren't successful. So the Zapatistas did not achieve full autonomy, at least not yet. And actually, in the early 2000s, the Zapatistas made a strategic decision to really suspend a lot of those externally oriented kind of branding, messages, recruiting, and they kind of disappeared from the international headlines. They didn't disappear, but they no longer were the darlings of the international solidarity movement. You didn't see headlines about them anymore. And instead, they continued and deepened the really intense work they were doing. And so although formally the San Andreas Peace Accords with the government, and still today, haven't been implemented, really the Zapatistas have, through an intense effort the last 15 years, made really significant gains. They've reclaimed lands, they've extended access of rudimentary health care and rudimentary education to rural areas, still inadequate, but some of the most meaningful gains that those communities had ever seen. They've really created lasting structures of inclusive and local governance. Those governance structures have been challenged in lots of little ways, internally, crises, problems, economic shortages, and they've held up. They've managed to sustain themselves. There's been a reduction of domestic violence in indigenous communities, rooted in part in a now 20-year-old prohibition of alcohol and other drugs. It was a prohibition that emerged through consensus. There's lots of disagreements, lots of men in the community that didn't like the idea, but it wasn't a top-down solution, and it's not implemented perfectly, but it is one of the sources the Zapatistas leaders point to for a major reduction, sustained reduction in domestic violence. And as I mentioned before, there really has been a steady uptick in anti-patriarchy framings in terms of who participates, whose ideas are welcome at the table, and how women are included. So while this is going on, the neoliberal economic policies that the Zapatistas were so angry about and that they symbolically rose up against on 1994 against the North American Free Trade Agreement, these policies racked up an enormous record of failure throughout Latin America. And we could go into great detail on that. But these economic policies led to tremendous forces of opposition to neoliberalism. Sometimes it was also support for alternatives. But there was less of that. But there was a widespread rejection of neoliberalism. And we began to see more and more leftist presidents and leftist governments being elected on the platform of rejecting these economic policies that they argued Washington, D.C. had imposed on their economies. And we saw more vibrant democratization. Mexico, for example, began to actually have competitive elections beginning in 2000, and actually saw transfers of power between the right, the other right, and the left. And we saw in Bolivia and Ecuador democratic elections. And we also saw the rise of identity politics, often being, in some of these countries I'm talking about today, meaning indigenous identity, but other identity politics as well. One of the things that was really dramatic in this era was what happened in Ecuador and in Bolivia. In Ecuador, in 1997, in 2000, and in 2005, elected presidents were forced from office. And in 2003 and 2005, Bolivian elected presidents were forced from office. And there's nuances to those 5 stories, and not all 5 of them, 4 of the 5 of them, indigenous resistance was key to it, one of them was not. But in general, these were dramatic times in Ecuador and Bolivia, where one of the sort of preeminent examples was the president was being forced from office, often by indigenous mobilization, and almost uniformly predicated on a rejection of these neoliberal reforms. And this came to be known as the pink tide. And so some of you are familiar with the late Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, an undemocratic leader. Some of you are familiar with Evo Morales, who I'm going to talk about today, and I would argue that for Morales' certainly first 10, 12 years in office was a very democratic leader. And so the pink tide kind of spans the political spectrum in terms of commitment to democracy. But the map here doesn't show the whole region, it shows all of South America, and shows that the extent of these leftist pink tide governments was quite substantial. The years are approximate, so 1998 is when Venezuela elected Chavez, 2012 is when we began to see some of this wane, but sort of in that period, that 14-year period, is when these leftist, democratically elected, even if they sometimes didn't govern democratically, but democratically elected presidents were elected that rejected these Washington, D.C. neoliberal economic reforms. And in Bolivia, the most dramatic example was in 2005, the election of Evo Morales, standard bearer of the MAS, the M-A-S, the Movement Towards Socialism. You can see M-A-S up there, it's a Spanish acronym. And when Morales was inaugurated, the first month of 2006, he was the first democratically elected indigenous president in the region. And this was really significant not only for Bolivia, but for indigenous struggles and left struggles throughout the region. other examples, Rafael Correa, a non-indigenous president, was elected just a year later in Ecuador in 2006, and although the indigenous movement kind of split with him pretty rapidly, the indigenous movement in Ecuador helped him get elected in 2006, and for a few months he was viewed as sort of the successful champion of Ecuador's indigenous movement. But something happened. These leaders, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, their supporters kind of soured on them. In Ecuador, it happened pretty rapidly. In Bolivia, it happened pretty slowly. In Bolivia, Morales' followers were very patient. They were unhappy with a variety of things and felt like the Evo Morales presidency was moving too slowly or didn't fully represent the indigenous agenda. Morales' supporters were very patient. And their basic stance was, hey, it took us centuries to dig this hole. It's going to take more than 10 years to dig our way out. And they said, give Evo Morales time. That's my summary of kind of the general stance. But by 2012, the pink tide era, it was beginning to show signs of weakness. And by 2015, we began to see a right turn. And here, so this is kind of a flip of what we think about in the United States, of blue being a Democratic, red being a Republican. So here the blue are representing the conservative end of the spectrum. And we see beginning in 2015 after the president, we see more and more countries are turning blue, turning toward conservative leadership. This map is for early 2019 for Bolivia here. The center in red, so this is when Evo Morales is still president, up through late last year. So what happened? What changed here? So in Argentina in 2015, Mauricio Macri was elected a conservative president. In Ecuador in 2017, the president was elected actually of the same party, the previous president, but quickly turned toward more conservative policies. In Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro was elected. Here he is with Trump's national security advisor, inaugurated in early 2019, and ushers in a reign of tremendous violence, encouraging the police to execute suspected criminals in the street, and just a terrifying level of repression in the state. And I don't mean to characterize the entire wave of this. There's variations here. Mauricio Macri, conservative leader in Argentina, has a whole number of conservative policies, but a very different political animal than, say, Bolsonaro in Brazil. And then in October, just this last year, Evo Morales is forced from office. He flees to Mexico, where he eventually launches a campaign to run for the Senate, but there he's forced from office, and it's a shock. So there's allegations of fraud that are seem credible to most observers, but it's unclear what the scope of the fraud was. And Evo Morales being forced from office comes at the end of him being in power for almost 14 years. 14 years in which he has insisted that he is the one and only leader of the indigenous majority in Bolivia. And so he hasn't nurtured protégés to replace him. He's, like so many presidents around the world of all ideological stripes, he's pushed for continuous re-election, being elected again and again, changing the Constitution in order to be re-elected. And so one of the questions that's motivated me in looking at Bolivia is trying to understand why Evo Morales' opponents, military and economic opponents, were able to force him from office. There's a lot that we don't know yet. So much of this has just happened. We know there was fraud. We don't really know the extent of it too much. We don't know everything that's going on, but we do know that Morales was vulnerable in 2019. And he didn't have the same level of legitimacy among his own supporters in 2019. Now, there were plenty of his supporters that are furious at him being forced from office, but he was a weaker president in 2018 and 2019 than earlier, even though his party has sort of grown, become a bigger tent party, reached out across party lines, across the aisle, so to speak. And so I'm curious about what led to this change. And so I asked this question: when indigenous movements help install a leftist president who fails them, why does tactical innovation decline? So social movement scholars care about tactical innovation. So the social movement scholars describe tactical innovation as social movement tactics that kind of stay a step ahead of the government. They kind of confuse the government, keep them off balance. Oftentimes these tactics are really creative and innovative. But the key thing about tactical innovation is that the government kind of sort of initially can't handle it. And these innovative tactics are able to win concessions and make progress for the movement. But in the Bolivia case, the social movement's already won the government. So it's kind of a curious and interesting situation in that the social movements managed to successfully elect their guy, but then the social movements continued. And so the bulk of social movements in Bolivia were supporters and enthusiastic allies of the president. Yet they continued to push their agenda because there's a lot of power in these movements and because their agenda wasn't being met. Even though they liked the president, they didn't want somebody else, but they weren't satisfied with the president. And I was curious as to why Bolivia's movements, and I'll get into some of the details there, that had been like the most powerful, the most legendary social movements anywhere, suddenly seemed much less effective once their own leader was in office. And some of the explanations that are out there are that, well, they were getting concessions, they were getting gains, so their grievances weren't as great, so that diminished their tactical innovation. They faced diminished threats because the Evo Morales government wasn't willing to frequently use violence against them. There was some, but not much. But I'm more curious about this third idea, which is that adaptations, tactical adaptations, they're called by social movement scholars. Tactical adaptations by the government, these leftist governments, are somehow kind of optimized to stall the innovation of the very movements that are their allies. And so the idea here is like, is there something actually in the way that Morales' supporters and Morales' government interact that actually made Morales more vulnerable and in a position to be forced from office? So what might be these responses from the government? So one thing that Morales, not unique in the case of Bolivia, but one thing that Morales' government did was performing decolonization. So dating back to the Zapatista era, there's not only rhetoric, but there's actual meaningful policies around trying to decolonize the economy, decolonize methods of governance. So some of this is real, and some of it's, a lot of it's real, but it's also a performative exercise to communicate, Evo Morales communicating that I am the champion of decolonization. I have put indigenous people in the government cabinet. I have put women in the cabinet. I am putting out rhetoric about the nationalization of resources, even if sometimes that nationalization is a lot less than meets the eye. Sometimes that nationalization of resources is actually pulling out the contract with the transnational corporation and making sure the transnational corporation actually pays the taxes they were supposed to pay, that they've just been not paying for a long time. Well, that's a good policy, but it's a far cry from actually nationalizing the resource. And so some of these policies, the Moscow government's making a big deal about, saying we are decolonizing the economy, and they're framing it in terms of saying it's us against the empire. It's us against the U.S. military and economic empire that is enacted through the Bolivian elites that we have thrown out of power. Now, I'm not saying this is an act. I'm not saying it's all theater. I'm saying that the Morales government makes a big show out of these meaningful policies, and that this is something that's difficult for the social movements to deal with, because it's kind of stealing their thunder. It's stealing their message. And this is the very message the social movements have been advocating is exactly what they're hearing from the government. Oh, and that picture, by the way, that's a giant 30-foot metal statue of Che Guevara. It greets you when you come into El Alto, the city of El Alto in Bolivia, which is an 80% plus indigenous city. It's the kind of cradle of indigenous resistance in the country of Bolivia. And Che Guevara there is standing on an eagle, the symbol of the United States. And so this is kind of the welcome to El Alto statue, is this Che Guevara standing on an American eagle. The second adaptation here by these pink-tied governments, like Evo Morales, is socialist extractivism. But extracting natural resources from the earth, but using the revenue, using the profits to actually make a difference socially. So this is kind of an interesting twist. So the social movements and the governments that have got Evo Morales into office have been challenging extractivism for generations, saying this economic model of plundering the earth and taking all its resources has to stop. But once in office, you got to run a government, and you got to pay for all the expenses. And Morales, like so many other presidents, is very difficult for him to simply stop the economic model. And so instead, it mostly continues, but with incremental changes. But the major change is that more in a meaningful way, more and more the profits, the revenue from this is actually improving equality in the country, and it's going to people who didn't have a share of the profits before. So it's socialist extractivism. And so environmental groups, indigenous environmental groups, are still in Bolivia really unhappy about this, because these are environmentally harmful mining practices and extraction, but they're actually being managed in a way that's more progressive than any government Bolivia has seen up until that time. And so this is tough for the social movements to deal with. Is what I'm not going to dwell on this slide, but for those who are familiar with the U.S. context and the U.S. civil rights movement, these concepts of tactical innovation by social movements and tactical adaptations by the U.S. government, this process of back and forth, come from McAdams' work on tactical interaction during the civil rights movement. And so the key thing here is that McAdam argues that there's these new innovations, bus boycotts, and then eventually, and it challenges the government, makes some progress, but eventually the government figures out how to stop it. Legal obstruction, extra-legal harassment. But then there's a new innovation, sit-ins. The government eventually figures out a way to stop it, or to stall it, or to make it less effective. But as long as the movement keeps innovating, freedom rides come, community-wide protests come, urban riots come, they can keep making headway. But when they're no longer able to innovate, they're no longer able to keep a step ahead, then the gains of the movement stall. That's McAdams' argument. Let's take a look at this 5-year period. Some of you are probably familiar with this. It's one of the more famous periods in Latin American history recently. 2000 and 2005. So this is the rise to power of Evo Morales and MAS, which are not new in Bolivia, but it's new that they're winning. So in this period, 2000 to 2005, there's a really fascinating series of struggles. I'm not going to go into the full detail. In Cochabamba, there's a battle for to stop the privatization of water. And that's what kicks it off. It's known as the Water War. And there's mass mobilization in Cochabamba, and it's successful. And the Bechtel Corporation and its Bolivian subsidiaries are kicked out of Cochabamba, and this privatization of water is reversed. And it's a major victory. It's still under a minority white Bolivian government that the indigenous majority feels is hostile to them and is exploiting them. But it's a really big victory scored in this moment in the Bolivian neoliberal era. And then there's a whole series of other protests. There's the Aymara peasant insurrections in the High Plains, tax protests, and I mentioned earlier really dramatic stories of, I mentioned earlier the two presidents being forced from office. So in 2003, President Sanchez de Lozada, Goni was his nickname, unveils a plan to export Bolivia's natural gas reserves by selling gas, to Mexico and California through a pipeline that's going to go through Chile. And the resistance argues that this policy is bad for Bolivia. Bolivia is going to be hurt by it. Bolivia can benefit from it. And it spawns escalating protests. So here's Isabel Atencio, the leader of the Women's Collective in El Alto. And during this conflict over the export of the gas in El Alto, Isabel Atencio and her neighbors are among the first to mobilize. So hundreds of thousands eventually mobilized. But she lives on Nestor Galindo Street in front of the home, and in front of her home, she and her colleagues began building a barricade, taking out all of this furniture, build a roadblock, get the kids to bring stuff out, put their bikes up there, and create this visible symbol of resistance that also obstructs traffic. Just one roadblock doesn't do much, but you multiply this throughout the city, and it eventually begins to paralyze the economy. So neighbors cumulatively began blockading this street by street to stop soldiers from transporting the gas. So the gas was first going to be trucked up the pipeline, so they would stop it, stop the soldiers, and this provoked conflict. And eventually escalated. And the story illustrates a number of innovations. These self-help street blockades that are eventually met by repression of the soldiers, Isabel Atencio and her many allies make a big deal out of the fact that they are women. We are housewives. We are just ordinary Bolivian women, but we are now soldiers in this struggle, and they make themselves kind of the face of this resistance. And initially, there are some minor concessions, some promises that are made to try and get them to calm down, typical sexist language toward these women, but eventually it's pretty quickly clear that these concessions are false promises that aren't going to be upheld. And then eventually it grows into a siege. So there's a metropolitan siege of both El Alto and the city below, La Paz. Traffic is halted, there's thousands of mobilizations, the economy is halted. And what I would argue is that the president resigning is kind of a last resort tactical adaptation by the government. Now sure, the president loses. He goes into exile and moves to, I think, Chevy Chase, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., San Jose de Lozada. But the government survives. So they get a new interim president, there's elections, there's a new white minority neoliberal president. So even though the president is forced from office, really, the regime has managed to quell this protest through presidential resignation. And business kind of continues as usual in Bolivia. In 2005, there's another such moment, the new hydrocarbons law. We won't get into the details, but it's another new piece of legislation that is going to deepen the commitment to a neoliberal economic model that exports Bolivia's resources. Here's Edgar Patana, a local union leader of a massive sort of umbrella union, the Regional Workers Central in El Alto, being interviewed in advance of this conflict. And so they eventually get on board and follow the lead of the women. So the women led, and now Edgar Patana, his group has 500,000 members. The FAHUVE, which is the neighborhood Federation of Neighborhood Councils, also claims to have close to 500,000 members. These groups get on board and follow the lead of the neighborhood women leaders. And now you've got really large numbers of people participating. And this is the second example of this metropolitan siege. Once again, paralyzes the economy, and we see women performing their roles as women, using their gender, kind of weaponizing it. They put on black clothes of mourning, go walking through the streets, symbolic mourning for the deaths of children that have been killed during the repression. And once again, President Mesa this time, Carlos Mesa, is forced to resign. He's not exiled. Here's La Paz. The whole city is paralyzed by this metropolitan siege. So this leads to the 2005. So that's the story there of 2005. But really, the second presidential resignation doesn't work. And Evo Morales hits the campaign trail, and he's not an outsider. He's been like running through party politics circles for years. He's a major union leader, and he becomes the standard bearer of all the indigenous movements in Bolivia. But what is new is that collectively, these social movement struggles have forced Bolivia to democratize and actually have a free and fair election where the result is going to be respected, and Morales wins in December of 2005 and is inaugurated shortly thereafter. So we're going to speed ahead here. To give you just a broad summary of this very complicated 13-year period, what's happened while Morales is in power. And what I find is that having this leftist indigenous president in power has actually made the social movement, has kind of muted some of the social movements. Both Morales' allies, who are there in green, and then, but interestingly, they're also able to mute opponents here in red. So without going into the full sort of chronology, which would take forever, the top row here is saying that one of the innovations we see when Evo Morales is in power is astroturf secessionism. So astroturf, for those who aren't familiar with the term in social movement scholarship, means fake grassroots. Okay, astroturf. So astroturf organizations are organizations that pretend to be grassroots bottom-up orgs, but really they're bankrolled by sometimes an actual bank. So they're fake grassroots groups that are actually very heavily subsidized by elite, rich interests that think that their cause is going to be supported by these groups. So Morales has a lot of enemies, and these groups bankroll fake grassroots groups that are demanding secession. They're demanding that the eastern lowlands of Bolivia that are whiter and richer secede and become, if not an independent country, an autonomous entity. Ironically, a bit like what the Zapatistas, different, but they have this autonomy claim in mind. But what's going on here is they say, we don't want this Indian presence. So there's a tremendous racism directed toward Evo Morales, but more substantively toward his policies. But Evo Morales' adaptations mute this astroturf secessionism. Big party building. So Morales, when he's elected, loses those rich, white, lowland areas. But 2 election cycles later, he wins the majority. Part of the reason he's unpopular with some of his own supporters is because he's moderated. He's reached out to those richer, whiter areas and begun to work with them on policies that are less radical and that are more amenable. And those leaders, they haven't given up on getting rid of Evo Morales, but they've seen that they can work with this president for a time. Here in the middle row, we see loyal contention. So we've got social movements that they've been mobilizing for generations in their families. This is what they do. They're good at it. So now that they've got a president in power they support, they keep mobilizing. So rather than lobbying, the way they're sort of advancing and asking for their agenda is through protests and through mobilization. But it's protests where they're sort of simultaneously got signs up demanding policy change, and they've got signs up saying support Evo. Okay? So they're not saying we want to get rid of Evo, they're saying we want to change what the Morales administration is doing. But these 2 items that I mentioned earlier, performing decolonization and socialist extractivism, are really powerful in terms of muting the demands of socialists, who are less and less able to contribute to the agenda of Mas over this 13-year period. And the more entrenched Mas becomes, the more it focuses on Morales' continuous re-election, the more it becomes an established hegemonic incumbent party, the less responsive it is to loyal contention. And the last thing we see is atomized contention, where we see lots of little groups that are protesting this cause and that cause, just because Bolivia is a very protest-heavy place. There's protests happening all the time, but it's not very effective. They're not on the right, they're not on the left, they're not for a particular cause, but they're just participating, and it becomes a very disorderly situation in which there's just routine. Protest becomes routine. Protest almost every day around different issues, but it's not focused on a particular agenda. And so, in 2019, when Morales, apparently, the best I can tell from what I've read, is guilty of helping engineer his own re-election through fraud, the social movements that elected him and supported him are substantially weakened. And I'm arguing they've been weakened in some ways by him. And those movements that don't want Morales gone at all, they're livid that Morales has been forced from office, but they're no longer as powerful. So Morales' own support base is no longer as present, and the white minority that has been angry for 13 years sees their moment, and they act decisively. And the second in command, the second vice president, takes the reins of power through a process some have argued is highly undemocratic, very quickly throws out the old cabinet, puts in a new cabinet that initially is all white men, and it gets tweaked a little bit, but it's just some of the, I should have had those photos of like the cabinet before and after, because visually, just very, very striking. And this government moves swiftly and violently to evict the Mas majority from power. Morales flees the country, and we see a rapid rise in repression, dozens of deaths, lots of violent incidents between the state and protesters. And the social movements are reeling and have not been able to counter this as of today in February. Let me just conclude, just restating that last point, and then talk about what can we do. So just to restate the last point, these major victories, won by the right in Bolivia, to me, don't suggest, excuse me, sorry. The major victories won against MAS, I think, shows us that in countries where we see indigenous power, it's a potentially ephemeral game, and that the deep racism and the deep hostility toward these indigenous leaders does not go away. Even with 13 years of victory, it's been stunning to people in Bolivia and just horrifying to see how brutally and violently and swiftly this racism has resurged. And this was normal for the 20th century, but there was a sense that that was in Bolivia's past, and it has come back with a tremendous fervor. And so those enemies are waiting in the wings and are ready to use violence. These are some of the same groups that actually worked with Morales in 2007, 2008, voted for him in some cases. They thought that was their best shot. And I think the other claim I'm making is that some of that vulnerability can actually come from the way these pink-tide governments, sometimes indigenous pink-tide governments, are governing, in that their effort to be the president, to cement the power of the president, can actually diminish the social movement base that put them in power. Last short piece is about what we can do here. I think we can be not only around education and awareness, but we can be active on our campuses and in Minnesota and in Latin America. On our own campuses, McAllister campus, Neil Hall was one of the buildings that I've been teaching in for years. Neil was one of the presidents of McAllister College, and students, activist students, including indigenous students as well as non-indigenous students at McAllister, uncovered the anti-indigenous past of Neil. One of the founders of McAllister College had some virulently racist writings about indigenous peoples. These students organized and demanded that the building be renamed. They wrote an entire special issue of our student newspaper, the Mac Weekly, called Colonial McAllister. 8 pieces of excellent journalism. It took our president and the board of trustees like a week to be convinced by this phenomenal research by our students, and those names were wiped clean. So Neil's name has been taken off. We're making an effort to document that part of our history. I think we can be active in Minnesota. In 2018, there were homeless encampments in the Twin Cities that had a significant indigenous population. And there were Native American reservations here in Minnesota that were concerned about the indigenous dimension of those homeless encampments. Those are issues for me in the Twin Cities that I, as a citizen, can be involved in and supportive of. I think, as you mentioned in your generous introduction, I try and publish my work in Spanish. So whatever work we do, it's important to not only publish it in a language accessible by the people that you're studying, but to then go and share it with them. So I made an effort to go back to Bolivia, go back to Peru, and bring print copies and online websites to point people to, here's your photo in the article I wrote about you, and here you might like it, you might not like it, but I'm going to share with you the results of my research. And I think that is really quite important. Let me end there and say thank you very much. What we have for time, but obviously questions, do that.
So, questions?
Yeah.
Or comments, right?
Questions, comments, all of them. Why don't you introduce yourselves as well? Tell me who I'm talking to. Please.
Hi, I'm Melissa.
Melissa.
Thank you so much for doing this talk. It was a really good way to start out the whole event.
Thank you.
So my question is that when you were doing research with these different communities, how do you feel like you conducted that research ethically? You mentioned that you were able to, while participating in the movement, so you gave the results back to the community, but any other way, especially while you were conducting?
Yeah. Broadly speaking, I think there's 2 ways, and I think going to the idea of like performing decolonization, I think it can be important to perform. So it can be meaningful, but also it can be important to make sure that people get the message. So I think in terms of the substance, I would say for me the key thing is relationship building. That I'm not just there to get the information I need and to leave, but rather I'm there to meet people and begin a relationship. Now, of course, there's people I talk to that I don't talk to again, but I'm nonetheless approaching it from a perspective of I'm expanding my community, I want to be part of your community, and all that that entails. So so that's one part of it. But I think there's also the idea of reciprocity and performance. Like one thing that we did that I'm proud of, so James Lariger, who took all these photos that I'm just amazed of Evo on the campaign trail and Subcomandante Marcos. So he also took a lot of photos that we typically don't use in presentations. That one of Isabel Atencia, though, is one of them. It's a portrait. So when we would go into communities and photograph, we would also say, we're coming on Saturday. Why don't you and your spouse and your children get all dressed up? And we'll take your portrait and we'll bring you back copies of a professional portrait of your family. So this was a little thing, but it was like a meaningful contribution that some of these families had never had like a chance to do a portrait sitting. And it was something that was sort of easy for us to do. We had a photographer, cost a little bit of extra money, a little bit of extra time. And to me, that was like a gesture of support. I think there's other deeper things that sort of are a higher level of commitment that, yes, so as you said, I co-founded a nonprofit in Lima, Peru. I didn't co-found a nonprofit in any of the other communities that I worked in, but that still matters. I mean, like when I work in Bolivia, when I go to Ecuador, well, I make a point of telling them, like, I'm involved in this community in Lima, Peru, and have been involved for 20 years. They don't expect me to be involved in every last community I work in, but I think that's meaningful to them that I'm sort of laying down roots and staying engaged in some of the communities. Thanks for the question. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Marina. Thank you again for coming. I really did appreciate the talk.
Thank you.
But at the beginning, you were kind of talking about how in order to understand indigenous movements anywhere kind of in the Americas, Bolivia was really critical for that. And with kind of the fall of Evo Morales, and some people could view that as kind of like a failure of indigenous movements, how are we seeing that ripple effect elsewhere because of that, or kind of explain that a little bit?
So I talked heavily about Mexico and Bolivia today. I didn't talk about Mapuche and Chile. I didn't talk about Ecuador and Guatemala's indigenous movements. I didn't talk about Peru's indigenous movements, which are largely in rural areas. There's a very modest urban, there's actually a large indigenous urban presence in Peru, but it's not very organized as such. It's not really organized in Peru as like an idea around the indigenous identity. So to me, my observation is that with this right turn in Latin America, we absolutely do see a regional diminution of indigenous power. And that we saw that before Evo was forced from power, and that Evo being forced from power is kind of emblematic of that regional shift. And I think it's really bad and really harmful for the region. And I guess that in some sense is I guess, the sort of bad news implication that I'm suggesting here in my kind of dire description of what happened in Bolivia. I'm arguing that there was this incredibly racist white minority in Bolivia that was just waiting for their moment, and they waited for it patiently, and it came, and they acted. And I think that's the case. That's definitely the case in Ecuador, in Guatemala, in Peru, in Mexico, where what gains we have seen for indigenous peoples, I think they are at risk. I think they are ephemeral to, not quite the right word, but they're fragile, I would say. I still think the case of Bolivia is a case of tremendous indigenous power. I think the indigenous movement in Bolivia has taken a severe blow, but I would not count them out. For generations, indigenous Bolivians were trying to gain something they'd never had. Now they've had it, and they want it back. And that's a different, speaking of someone who studies social movements, it's like a better place to be in as an organizer, trying to get something back that's been taken from you rather than something that you've never had access to. Excuse me. I do think it is really unfortunate for the indigenous movement in Bolivia that Evo Morales' vision of power, that he didn't trust others within his own movement to be that leader. And that there were multiple moments that he could have been training protégés, that he could have been having a future-oriented vision. And I think that's just a really tremendously unfortunate decision by him and his advisors. There's another one here, yeah.
Hi, I'm Blake. I'm curious, in the past 3 months, how the Bolivian people have been responding to the new government protests, or what's been
been really awful. So there are absolutely, there's sort of chronic protests, and there's been a lot of repression, and there's been dozens of deaths. And there's, although the country's moving toward new elections, there's no faith that the interim government will follow through in a responsible way. And there's just really a lot of just disheartened Mas supporters who they themselves were really angry with fraud by Mas and really angry with Morales. But they're not at all supportive of what's transpired. And those sort of critics of Morales within Mas don't trust at all what's going to happen next, that it's going to be democratic, that it's going to be legitimate. They, I think, would, many of the ones, I guess I've talked to some of them, would agree with this kind of insidious argument I'm making that the white minority in Bolivia, they smell blood, they've acted, and they're going to keep acting. And so, because a democratic election in Bolivia is going to generate, it's an indigenous majority state. So in a democratic situation, you're going to see, whether or not you see an indigenous president, you're going to see indigenous power if it's a democratic system. And so there's a lot of fear and uncertainty over how the white minority is going to try and shape things to ensure their own power in their own place. Sorry, my voice is giving out here. Others?
We have a program in Guatemala, and so I was wondering with talking about the Zapatistas in Chiapas, if there was any shift in connection with indigenous people of Guatemala and Chiapas that was that kind of movilización was supported to remind people.
So, thinking about the word exported there. The context of tactics of decolonization, right? So, one of the things that you've seen in the 2000s with the rise of indigenous movements in Ecuador and Bolivia is the word's a little too strong. I'm still going to use it because I think it makes the point clearly. The slight professionalization of indigenous movement leaders. Not in a bad way, but you see annual cumbres, annual conferences and summits, and a lot of these efforts used to be not only in a particular country, but even in a particular region of the country. So Ecuador does have Ecuador is the national federation of all indigenous groups, but really one of the primary organizing mechanisms in Ecuador is subnational entities like Ecuador, which is kind of the area around Quito, Ecuador, and the mountains there. And so, but it used to be that each of those entities would kind of have its own leadership school and have its own practices internally, and the connections between them were weaker. But one of the things that has happened in the 2000s and 2010s is there's been more funding and more money to facilitate kind of cross-national visits and travel. And so the work that I've done in these countries since, say, 2007 until 2015, many of the people that I was talking to just in the last 5 years had taken their first trip to Chiapas from Bolivia, or they had an annual meeting of sharing tactics with Ecuadorian activists coming to Bolivia. And you saw, I'm interviewing Ecuadorian social movement leaders who are here's my photo of me and Evo Morales. I got to Bolivia, I got to meet the president of Bolivia. And so I think there's a much greater sharing of this. And so certainly on the Guatemala-Mexico border that has happened a good deal. But the Guatemalan indigenous slight majority has experienced far harsher genocide than the Mexican minority, which has also experienced tremendous violence and oppression. And the power structures in Guatemala have been, I would argue, far more sort of impenetrable for indigenous activists in Guatemala. In Mexico, one of the Zapatistas have kind of partially won one of their goals, which was to get the Mexican state to partly leave them alone. Certainly not to the extent they'd like, but they were partially successful. Whereas in Guatemala, I don't think we see that success at all. Other questions?
So I'm Millennium, and bringing back tactics used by indigenous people in Latin America. How could we here at CSB, as both faculty and students, as an institution built, like you said, stated earlier, on Dakota land, actually contribute to decolonization and actually practice that in our institutions outside of, like your example at McAllister,
Yep.
Renaming the building or holding seminars on decolonization.
So I think the starting point is to talk to indigenous student groups and local indigenous community leaders and ask if you can be of support and ask how one could be an ally. At McAllister, land acknowledgements have become common at the start of events. But I would think, it would be inappropriate to do that if there hadn't been a consultation with McAllister indigenous student groups and faculty and local Twin Cities groups. And it was them that said, we'd like you to do this. This is a small step that we would like you to do. And I think that's really crucial. Let's say you're studying away in Chile, in Bolivia, you're on a study abroad program, and there are activist things happening, there are protests happening. Should you participate? Well, your study abroad program is not going to want you to. But you want to be of support. So what's the first thing you do? Well, you talk to those people that you want to be of support of and get to know them and ask, right? And so I mentioned the Colonial McAllister special issue of our newspaper. So I know most of the journalists there's 8 key journalists who wrote those 8 articles, maybe 6 key journalists, and most of them are white. But they consulted with PIPE, P-I-P-E is the acronym of our Proud Indigenous Peoples student group on campus. They consulted with that group about that project in order to be supportive of PIPE's demand that Neal Hall be renamed. And so that was, I think, a really positive process. I mean, one, I think, funny but also harsh truth. That was, I think, a wonderful quote when the story of Neal Hall being renamed got written up in our student newspaper. Those journalists, the final quote of the newspaper article was quoting one of the PIPE leaders. And quoting the PIPE leader saying, we've been asking for Neal Hall to be renamed for like 7 years. It could have saved us a lot of trouble if we just asked a white person to write about it sooner. They meant that as kind of a stinging joke with some truth to it. The way that those 8 articles were written, they were written by students who kind of, through a variety of ways, knew the right vocabulary and language and how to frame this in a way. It was remarkable that our college president read that issue in like a day, made a recommendation to the board of trustees. I mean, I was teaching comparative social movements last fall, and one of my students, Elika Samani, who was one of the activist students on this issue, her whole research project for my comparative social movements class was like an action plan for like next steps on this quest to rename Neal Hall. And she was going to finish this like 25-page research paper that had an action plan for how to pursue the renaming of Neal Hall. And they'd already won, before the deadline. She said, "What do I do with my paper, Paul?" So we took it, extended it beyond that. But it was quite remarkable. Does that answer your question? Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned that it was critical to understand the things that are happening in Latin America, to understand the protests in Ontario, and maybe like Line 3 here in Minnesota. Could you talk a little bit more about the connection between the two?
So I think part of the connection, like I'm passionate about Latin America. Like that's where my energy has gone for many, many years. But I think the struggles here around indigenous peoples are important, certainly in their own right, but they're actually also important for me if I want to make a difference in Latin America. So like here's Humberto Cholango, president of Decolonization 2008, and we went to interview him. We actually went to get his permission to interview all the women leaders. We were doing a project on women leaders of social movements, mostly indigenous movements in Ecuador and Bolivia. So we needed his permission as the president before we started knocking on all the doors in his organization. So we made an appointment to go talk to him to ask if we could do a case study of Ecuador and Nigeria for this project. And Humberto Jolonga was on CNN the day before, denouncing foreign white academics, saying, why do they come here and take what they need and leave? Why don't they go back and focus on indigenous struggles in the United States? So that was, he said this on CNN. Like, why do they come here and study us? Like, there's plenty of work to be done. And so, like, when we went in to talk to him, he's like, here's me with Evo Morales. Like, I'm a friend of Evo. Like, why should I let you talk to my organization? So our photographer, James, was like, well, here's me and Evo. We're friends too. And then everything was fine. We got things all in. But I think, that critique from Humberto, I think resonated with me. And I think for me, the issue that I actually most care about now is incarceration in Minnesota. I used to teach in a prison in California. I taught at San Quentin for a few years, so I have some experience in this, but I haven't really worked that much on that issue in Minnesota. And I mentioned that statistic at the beginning of the presentation about indigenous peoples being 8 times overrepresented in prisons. And so for me, that's an issue that's not in the headlines, there aren't news stories being written about. But for me, that's an issue I care a lot about and want to make a difference on. And so I'm working with an organization in the Twin Cities called Children of Incarcerated Caregivers that focuses on, as you can tell from the name, children whose parents, Native American parents, included in many cases, are being impacted by incarceration. Any other questions? All right. We've been a wonderful audience. I will stick around if you want to talk to me one-on-one, and if you want to reach out to me about anything, I'm easy to find on the internet. Thank you very much.
And a reminder to say when March 25th for our second event. You'll see the email.
So the question, Blake?
That's what I'm looking at.